The morning mist clung to the Marne River like the breath of dying men, as Captain Daniel Daly crouched behind the crumbling stone wall of a French farmhouse. It was June 1st, 1918, and the sound of German artillery had been growing closer for 3 days straight. The earth trembled beneath his boots with each thunderous impact, sending dirt cascading from the rafters above, where exhausted French civilians huddled in terror. "Captain, we've got movement to the north," whispered Corporal James Harrison, his rifle trained on the tree line beyond the wheat fields. The young Marine's hands shook slightly, not from fear, Daly noted, but from the constant vibration of the bombardment that had been pounding the Château-Thierry sector since dawn. The German spring offensive had shattered the western front like glass. General Erich Ludendorff's forces had punched through Allied lines with devastating efficiency, advancing closer to Paris than any enemy had managed since 1870. Now, the Kaiser's elite stormtroopers were less than 50 miles from the French capital, and panic was spreading through the government quarters like wildfire. Daly adjusted his steel helmet and peered through his field glasses at the approaching figures. Gray-green uniforms moved between the trees, at least a company's worth of German infantry, their distinctive pickelhaube helmets glinting in the filtered sunlight. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of a Maxim machine gun crew hauled their deadly apparatus forward. "Marine, keyword to Lieutenant Colonel James Harbert immediately," Daly ordered, never taking his eyes off the enemy advance. "Tell him the Germans are probing our left flank, and remind him what General Pershing told us back at Quantico. We're not just fighting for France anymore. We're fighting to prove that American Marines can stand toe-to-toe with the best soldiers Europe has ever seen." According to contemporary reports from the Chicago Tribune, the situation had become so desperate that French Marshal Ferdinand Foch had personally requested American reinforcements, stating that the fate of Western civilization hangs in the balance at Château-Thierry. The newspaper's war correspondent noted that this marked the first time in the Great War that American forces would face German troops in major offensive operations. The young corporal sprinted away across the battle-scarred courtyard, dodging shell craters that had appeared overnight like malevolent flowers, blooming in the rich French soil. Daly remained at his post, watching as more German soldiers emerged from the forest. Their movements were precise, methodical, the hallmark of troop who had been winning battles for long years. But these weren't just any Americans waiting in the trenches and farmhouses of Château-Thierry. These were United States Marines, men who had earned their reputation fighting Barbary pirates, Mexican revolutionaries, and savage battles across the Pacific. They had volunteered to cross an ocean to fight in a war that many Americans still considered Europe's problem. As the German advance guard drew closer, Daly could make out individual faces beneath their helmets. Young men, not unlike his own Marines, but hardened by years of trench warfare and convinced of their inevitable victory. They had good reason for confidence. The spring offensive had already gained more ground in months than either side had managed to capture in the previous 3 years combined. The captain checked his watch. 0800 hours. In approximately 6 hours, if intelligence reports were accurate, the full weight of the German 28th Division would crash against the hastily prepared American defensive positions. The Marines had been in these positions for less than 48 hours, barely enough time to dig proper foxholes, let alone establish the kind of defensive network that had defined warfare on the Western Front. Thunder rolled across the countryside, but Daly knew it wasn't a storm approaching. It was the sound of German artillery finding its range. The German shells began falling like mechanical rain at precisely 1000 hours on June 2nd, 1918. Sergeant Major Daniel Webster pressed his face against the muddy floor of his foxhole as earth and shrapnel sprayed overhead in deadly fountains. Each explosion sent tremors through the ground that he could feel in his bones, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match his own thundering heartbeat. "Keep your heads down, Marines," Webster shouted over the cacophony, though his voice was nearly swallowed by the continuous roar of incoming artillery. Around him, the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment lay pressed against whatever cover they could find: hastily dug trenches, abandoned farm equipment, the twisted remnants of what had once been a prosperous French village. Through the smoke and dust, Webster could see the dark outline of Belleauwood rising like a green fortress. Approximately 1 mile to the northwest, intelligence reports suggested that German machine gun nests had been established throughout the forest, turning every tree into a potential death trap. The wood covered nearly 1 square mile of dense undergrowth and ancient oak trees, terrain that heavily favored defenders. Sergeant Major, Private First Class Robert Williams crawled through the mud toward Webster's position, his uniform already stained brown with French soil. "Colonel Harbert wants to see you at the command post immediately," He says the French are falling back all along the line. Webster cursed under his breath. The Marines had been positioned to support French forces, but if their allies were retreating, it would leave the Americans exposed on multiple flanks. He grabbed his rifle and began the dangerous sprint across open ground toward the stone farmhouse that served as battalion headquarters. The building had taken several direct hits during the morning bombardment, leaving gaping holes in the walls and roof tiles scattered across the courtyard like broken teeth. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel James Harbert stood over a map table, his face grim as he studied intelligence reports that had arrived via motorcycle courier. Just minutes earlier, the situation has deteriorated rapidly, Harbert announced as Webster entered and saluted. French General Jean de Gaulle has ordered a general withdrawal to positions south of the Marne River. However, our orders from General John Pershing are explicit: American forces will hold their ground at all costs, as documented in military records preserved by the National Archives. This decision represented a crucial moment in American military history. For the first time, U.S. forces would fight as an independent command rather than simply reinforcing Allied positions. The weight of national honor rested on the shoulders of fewer than 8,000 Marines. Webster studied the tactical map spread across the wooden table. Red arrows indicated confirmed German positions, while blue lines showed the current American defensive perimeter. Between the two forces lay approximately 300 yards of open farmland, offering little cover for either attacking or defending troops. "Sir, what about artillery support?" Webster inquired, noting the absence of American heavy guns in the immediate area. "Limited at best," Harbert replied grimly. "The French are withdrawing their artillery along with their infantry. We'll have some support from the 7th to 7th Field Artillery, but they're running low on shells after 3 days of continuous firing." Through the shattered windows of the farmhouse, they could hear the distinctive sound of German voices carried on the wind. The enemy was clearly massing for a major assault, probably timed to coincide with the French withdrawal. If successful, German forces would break through Allied lines and have a clear path to Paris. "Gentlemen," Harbert continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had fought in the Philippines and understood the stakes, "we are about to face the finest assault troops in the German army. They have been advancing steadily for 3 months and believe themselves invincible. Our job is to prove them wrong." Webster nodded grimly. Outside, the artillery bombardment was beginning to shift, targeting areas further behind American lines, a clear indication that infantry assault was imminent. The real battle for Château-Thierry was about to begin, and every Marine knew that failure would mean not just military defeat, but the potential collapse of the entire Western Front. The sound of German stormtroopers assembling in the wheat fields grew louder with each passing minute. At precisely 1400 hours on June 3, 1918, the German assault erupted across the wheat fields like a gray-green tidal wave. Lieutenant Michael O'Brien watched through his periscope as hundreds of enemy soldiers emerged from concealed positions, their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun as they advanced in disciplined waves toward the Marine defensive line. "Here they come, boys," O'Brien shouted to his platoon of 3rd Battalion Marines. "Remember your training and make every shot count." The German infantry moved with the mechanical precision that had made them the terror of Europe. For 4 years, they advanced in short rushes, with supporting squads providing covering fire while assault groups bounded forward to the next available cover. It was textbook stormtrooper tactics, refined through countless battles against French and British forces. Corporal Timothy Murphy settled his Springfield rifle against his shoulder and drew a bead on a German sergeant who was directing troops from behind a stone wall, approximately 200 yards away. The Marine had grown up hunting deer in the forests of Maine, and these distances felt comfortable despite the chaos erupting around him. "Fire at will," came the command from down the line, and suddenly the morning air filled with the sharp crack of American rifles. Murphy squeezed his trigger and watched with satisfaction as the German sergeant spun and fell. But for every enemy soldier that dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. The German advance was supported by machine gun fire from positions that had been established during the night. The distinctive stuttering sound of Maxim guns created deadly crossfire patterns across the open ground, forcing the Marines to keep their heads down even as enemy infantry drew closer to their positions. Private First Class Anthony Rossi crouched in a shell crater that had been carved out by German artillery the previous day. The Italian-American from Brooklyn had joined the Marines to prove his patriotism to neighbors, who questioned his loyalty due to his family's origins. Now, with German soldiers advancing directly toward his position, such concerns seemed absurdly distant. According to war correspondents' reports published in the New York Herald, The German assault represented one of the most concentrated attacks launched during the spring offensive. Military analysts estimated that an entire division of approximately 15,000 men was committed to breaking through the American sector at Château-Thierry. "Rossi, can you see their left flank?" Corporal Murphy called out, his rifle already trained on another target. The Germans were attempting to envelope the Marine position by advancing through a small grove of apple trees that provided concealment from direct observation. "I count at least 30 moving through the orchard," Rossi replied, his own Springfield ready. "They're trying to get behind Lieutenant Patterson's section." The tactical situation was rapidly becoming critical. German forces were not only advancing frontally, but were simultaneously attempting to turn both American flanks. If successful, the Marines would be surrounded and cut off from retreat routes back toward the Marne River. Lieutenant O'Brien made a rapid assessment of his tactical options. His platoon held a front of approximately 300 yards, but German pressure was concentrating on a narrow sector, where the terrain offered the best approach routes. Machine gun fire was becoming increasingly accurate as enemy crews found their range and began to systematically target American positions. "Murphy, take your squad and reinforce the left flank," O'Brien ordered. "Rossi, you're with me. We're going to attempt a flanking movement of our own." The young officer knew that passive defense would ultimately fail against such overwhelming numbers. Marines had always been trained to take the initiative, to attack when conventional wisdom suggested defense. It was a philosophy that had served them well in previous conflicts, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. As German soldiers continued to advance across the wheat field, their officers could be heard shouting encouragement in their native language. These were experienced troops, veterans of campaigns in Russia, Italy, and France. They had broken British lines at Cambrai and shattered French defenses along the Chemin des Dames. They had every reason to believe that these young Americans would collapse under pressure, just as so many Allied units had done before. But the Marines of Château-Thierry had other ideas. As the range closed to less than 100 yards, orders rang out along the American line: "Fix bayonets." The sound of steel sliding against steel echoed across the battlefield as 800 Marines prepared to meet the German assault with cold American steel. The clash came at 1500 hours with the brutal finality of hammer against anvil. German stormtroopers, their faces blackened with cordite and determination, crashed into Marine positions with bayonets extended and potato masher grenades clutched in their fists. The sound of steel against steel rang across the battlefield like a deadly symphony as two of the world's finest fighting forces met in mortal combat. Sergeant First Class William Henderson found himself face to face with a German corporal, whose uniform bore the distinctive markings of the 4th Prussian Guard Division. The enemy soldier was taller and heavier, his eyes holding the cold confidence of a man who had survived 3 years of trench warfare. But Henderson had grown up in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and his arms carried the strength of a man accustomed to hard labor. "Come on, you Hun bastard," Henderson growled, parrying a vicious thrust with his bayonet before driving his own blade toward the German's midsection. The enemy soldier deflected the attack and responded with a butt stroke that caught Henderson in the shoulder, sending him staggering backward. Around them, the battle had degenerated into dozens of individual duels as the careful formations of both armies dissolved into desperate hand-to-hand combat. Marines and German soldiers grappled in shell craters, fought with rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands across terrain that had been torn apart by 3 days of continuous bombardment. Private Samuel Jackson, barely 19 years old and fresh from a farm in Kansas, found himself defending a machine gun position against 3 German attackers. His rifle had jammed after firing his last round. The first German soldier came at him with a trench knife, a wicked curved blade designed specifically for close-quarters combat. Jackson sidestepped the thrust and drove his bayonet up under the man's ribs, feeling the terrible resistance as steel penetrated flesh and bone. The German gasped and fell, but his companions pressed forward immediately. Captain Daniel Daly, the Marine legend who had already earned 2 medals of honor in previous campaigns, rallied a squad of his men for a counterattack against German positions that had captured a stone farmhouse on the regiment's left flank. The building commanded crucial fields of fire, and its loss threatened to compromise the entire American defensive line. "Follow me, Marines," Daly shouted, leading the charge across 30 yards of open ground while German machine gun bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. "We'll show these Germans what American fighting men can do." According to battlefield reports compiled by military historians and preserved in the Marine Corps' Historical Division archives, The fighting at Château-Thierry represented some of the most intense close-quarters combat experienced by American forces during the entire war. Casualty rates exceeded 30% in some units, as both sides fought with desperate determination. The farmhouse had been converted into a fortress, with German machine gun crews positioned at every window and sandbags stacked around the doorways. Daly's assault team reached the building's walls, but progress stalled as defenders poured concentrated fire down on the attacking Marines. "Henderson, can you get a grenade through that window?" Daly called out, pressing himself against the stone wall as bullets chipped fragments from the masonry above his head. Henderson pulled the pin from one of his precious grenades and hurled it through the shattered window frame. The explosion inside the building was followed by screams and the temporary cessation of machine gun fire. Daly immediately led his men through the breach, fighting room by room to clear German defenders. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Lieutenant O'Brien's platoon was engaged in equally desperate fighting as German forces attempted to turn the American position. The young officer had been wounded twice, once in the arm by shrapnel, and again in the leg by a German bayonet, but continued to direct his men's fire against the advancing enemy. The battle was reaching its climax as ammunition began running low on both sides. Marines were reduced to fighting with captured German weapons, while enemy soldiers struggled to maintain their assault without adequate artillery support. The outcome would ultimately depend on which force could maintain its will to fight as casualties mounted and exhaustion took its toll. As the sun began to set on June 3, 1918, the wheat fields around Château-Thierry were littered with the bodies of both American Marines and German soldiers, testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the determination of both armies. Dawn on June 4, 1918, revealed a battlefield transformed into a charnel house. The wheat fields that had waved golden in the morning breeze just days before were now trampled flat, stained dark with blood, and pocked with shell craters that held the broken bodies of Marines and German soldiers alike. But the American line had held through the night, and that fact alone sent shockwaves through German high command. Major General James Harbord moved carefully through the Marine positions. As the morning mist began to lift, surveying the damage from the previous day's assault, his men were exhausted, many wounded, all of them running dangerously low on ammunition. Yet there was something in their eyes of fierce pride that had been forged in the crucible of combat that told him they would fight again if necessary. Report, Sergeant Major, Harbord ordered as Daniel Webster approached, his uniform torn and stained, but his bearings still military despite the ordeal. "Sir, we've held all primary positions," Webster replied, consulting notes he had scrawled on a piece of cardboard torn from a ration box. "Casualties are heavy, approximately to 100 killed or wounded out of 800 effectives, but German losses appear to be much higher based on body counts in front of our positions." Through his field glasses, Harbord could see German soldiers constructing new defensive positions approximately 500 yards to the north. The enemy had withdrawn during the night, tacit acknowledgement that their assault had failed. But intelligence reports suggested that fresh divisions were moving up from reserve positions, which meant the respite would be temporary. Corporal Murphy crouched in what had been a French farmer's vegetable garden, now transformed into a fighting position surrounded by empty cartridge cases and discarded equipment. His rifle lay across his knees as he shared a can of cold beans with Private Rossi. Both men too tired to speak, but drawing comfort from each other's presence. "You think they'll try again today?" Rossi asked quietly, his eyes never leaving the tree line where German observers were undoubtedly watching American positions. "Count on it," Murphy replied grimly. "But we showed them yesterday that Marines don't break. Word is getting back to their high command that they've run into something different here at Château-Thierry." Indeed, German after-action reports captured weeks later would reveal the profound impact that Marine resistance had on enemy morale. General Ludendorff himself had received urgent communications describing American forces as exceptionally tenacious and fighting with unusual determination. The term Teufelhunden, devil dogs, began appearing in German intelligence summaries, a grudging acknowledgement of Marine fighting prowess. According to contemporary accounts published in the Stars and Stripes military newspaper, the successful defense of Château-Thierry marked a turning point in American military confidence. For the first time since entering the war, U.S. forces had met the finest German assault troops in open battle and emerged victorious. Lieutenant O'Brien, his left arm in a makeshift sling, moved among his surviving platoon members to check on their condition and redistribute ammunition. The young officer had aged years in a single day of combat, but his leadership had held his unit together during the most critical moments of the German assault. "Listen up, Marines," O'Brien addressed his men, his voice carrying despite his obvious exhaustion. "Command says we've got reinforcements coming up from reserve positions. Fresh troops, full ammunition loads, and hot food. We've done the hard part. We've proven that American Marines can stand against the best soldiers. Germany can throw at us." The sound of German artillery began again in the distance, but it was lighter than the previous day's bombardment, possibly indicating that enemy commanders were conserving shells for other sectors of the front. The Marines used this relative quiet to improve their positions, evacuate wounded comrades, and prepare for whatever the enemy might attempt next. As afternoon approached, French civilians began emerging from cellars and hidden shelters where they had waited out the battle. An elderly farmer approached Captain Daly's position, tears streaming down his weathered face as he surveyed the destruction of his property. "Merci, Amis Americains," the old man said simply, pressing a bottle of wine into Daly's hands. "You have saved our village." Daly accepted the gift solemnly, understanding that this moment represented something larger than military victory. These Marines had not only held their ground against impossible odds, they had proven that America could stand as an equal partner in the struggle for Western civilization. The devil dogs of Château-Thierry had found their place in history. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1918, hung over the Marne Valley like a shroud as Marines prepared for their first major offensive operation of the war. After 4 days of defensive fighting, General John Pershing himself had ordered American forces to launch a counterattack designed to push German forces back across the river and eliminate the threat to Paris once and for all. Colonel James Harbord crouched in the basement of what had once been Château-Thierry's town hall, now serving as the advanced command post for the operation. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red arrows indicating German positions and blue lines showing planned American assault routes. The weight of command pressed heavily on his shoulders. This would be the largest American offensive action of the Great War. "Gentlemen," Harbord addressed his battalion commanders, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "Our objective is to advance approximately 2 miles and secure the north bank of the Marne River. Intelligence estimates suggest we'll face elements of 3 German divisions, including stormtrooper units that have been reinforced specifically to hold this sector." Major Thomas Holcomb, commanding the 2nd Battalion, studied the terrain maps with the practiced eye of a professional soldier. The ground between American positions and their objectives was open farmland offering minimal cover, while German defensive positions had been improved steadily over the past week. It would be a frontal assault against prepared positions, the most difficult type of military operation. "Sir, what about artillery support?" Holcomb inquired, noting the limited number of guns available to support the attack. "We'll have a 30-minute barrage beginning at 0500 hours, Harbord replied. "Not as much as we'd like, but every shell we can spare. After that, it's up to the Marines to close with the enemy and finish the job with rifle and bayonet." As documented in official Marine Corps records held at Quantico, this assault would mark the first time that American forces attempted to break prepared German defensive positions through direct attack. Previous American operations had been limited to defensive actions or small-scale raids, making the Château-Thierry counteroffensive a crucial test of U.S. military capabilities. In forward positions, Marines made final preparations for the assault. Sergeant Major Webster moved among his men, checking equipment and offering quiet words of encouragement. These were the same Marines who had held the line against impossible odds just days before. But offensive operations required different skills and different courage. "Remember, boys," Webster told a group of young privates who would be going into combat for the first time, "we're not just fighting for military objectives here. We're fighting to show the world that American Marines can take ground from the best soldiers Germany has produced. Every yard we advance brings us closer to ending this war." Private First Class Jackson, the farm boy from Kansas who had distinguished himself during the defensive fighting, checked his rifle one final time and adjusted the straps on his equipment pack. Around him, other Marines were engaged in the same ritual of careful preparation that separates professional soldiers from amateur warriors. The German positions they would assault had been strengthened with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and interlocking fields of fire that could devastate attacking infantry. Enemy commanders had learned from previous battles and were determined not to give ground easily. The cost of failure would be measured not just in American casualties, but in the potential collapse of Allied morale across the entire Western Front. At exactly 0500 hours, American artillery opened fire with a thunderous roar that shook windows in villages 10 miles away. Shells screamed overhead like express trains, impacting German positions with eruptions of flame and steel that could be seen clearly despite the pre-dawn darkness. For 30 minutes, the bombardment continued with mechanical precision, targeting known enemy strongpoints and communication trenches. Lieutenant O'Brien, his wounded arm now functional despite persistent pain, gathered his platoon in the jumping-off trench that had been dug just 50 yards from German positions during the night. His men were tense but ready, their faces blackened with cork and their bayonets fixed for close combat. "When the artillery lifts, we go over the top," O'Brien announced, checking his watch as the final minutes ticked away. "Our objective is that farmhouse with the red roof, approximately 400 yards northeast. We'll advance by rushes, using whatever cover we can find." The bombardment ceased abruptly at 05:30 hours, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to press against the eardrums. Then, along a front stretching for nearly 2 miles, 8,000 American Marines rose from their positions and began the advance that would determine the fate of the Marne Valley. The charge began with a sound that would echo through military history, 8,000 Marines rising as one from their positions and advancing across the shell-torn fields of Château-Thierry, with bayonets fixed and battle cries on their lips. The morning of June 6, 1918, would mark the moment when American forces seized the initiative on the Western Front and began driving the German army back toward its own borders. Captain Daniel Daly led the advance of his company across ground that had been churned into a moonscape by days of artillery bombardment. Shell craters provided some cover, but German machine gun crews had survived the bombardment, were now pouring concentrated fire into the attacking Marines. The distinctive sound of Maxim guns created a deadly symphony that cut down the first wave of attackers before they had advanced 50 yards. "Keep moving," Daly shouted, leaping over a stone wall that had been reduced to rubble. "Don't bunch up, make yourselves hard targets." Behind him, Marines spread out in loose formations that had been learned through bitter experience during the defensive fighting. They moved in short rushes, using whatever cover the terrain provided, always maintaining forward momentum despite the increasingly accurate German fire. This was warfare as it had been practiced by Marines in small conflicts around the world, aggressive, personal, and utterly relentless. Sergeant Major Webster found himself pinned down by machine gun fire from a German position that had been established in what remained of a stone barn approximately 200 yards ahead. The enemy crew had survived the artillery bombardment by taking shelter in the building's basement, and they were now systematically targeting any Marine who attempted to advance across the open ground. "Corporal Murphy," Webster called out to his most reliable non-commissioned officer, "can you work around to the left and get behind that position?" Murphy nodded grimly and began crawling through a drainage ditch that offered concealment from direct observation. With him went 3 other Marines, all of them understanding that success depended on eliminating the machine gun nest before it could inflict more casualties on the advancing companies. The tactical situation was fluid and dangerous. German defensive positions had been designed to provide interlocking fields of fire, meaning that each strong point could support its neighbors. As Marines advanced against one position, they exposed themselves to fire from adjacent German emplacements. Only through coordinated small unit actions could the assault succeed. Lieutenant O'Brien's platoon had advanced approximately 300 yards when they encountered a German counterattack. Launched from concealed positions in a grove of apple trees, enemy stormtroopers emerged from hidden trenches with potato masher grenades in their hands and the desperate fury of soldiers fighting for their lives. According to battlefield dispatches filed by war correspondents and preserved in the National Archives, the fighting at this stage of the battle reached levels of intensity that exceeded even the previous defensive actions. Marines and German soldiers fought hand-to-hand among the apple trees, using rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, and bare hands in a struggle that would determine the outcome of the entire offensive. "Fix bayonets and charge," O'Brien commanded, his voice carrying over the sound of gunfire and exploding grenades. His remaining Marines, fewer than 30 men from the original platoon of 4 to 5, rose from cover and advanced directly into the German counterattack. The collision was brutal and decisive. Marines, fighting with the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant death, drove the German stormtroopers back through the apple grove and beyond. Private Jackson, the young farmer from Kansas, found himself in single combat with a German sergeant who had been decorated for valor on the Russian front. The struggle lasted less than a minute, but it seemed to stretch for eternity as both men fought with the knowledge that only one would survive. As the morning progressed, Marine units began achieving their objectives despite heavy casualties. The red roof farmhouse that had served as O'Brien's initial target was captured after a fierce fight that left 12 Marines dead and twice that number wounded. But the position was taken, and American forces were now established on ground that German commanders had considered impregnable. By noon, the tactical situation had shifted decisively in favor of American forces. German positions throughout the Château-Thierry sector were falling to Marine assault teams that combined individual courage with small unit tactics learned through for days of defensive combat. Enemy commanders, recognizing that their positions had become untenable, began ordering withdrawals across the Marne River. Captain Daly stood in the ruins of what had been the German command post for the entire sector, surveying maps and documents that revealed the scope of enemy defensive preparations. The Marines had not only achieved their immediate objectives, they had shattered German confidence in their ability to hold positions against American assault. As the sun set on June 6, 1918, Marines controlled the north bank of the Marne River from Château-Thierry eastward for approximately 5 miles. The German threat to Paris had been eliminated, and American forces had proven themselves capable of offensive operations against the finest soldiers in the world. The Battle of Château-Thierry was over. The legend of the Marine Corps had begun.